In October and November 2020, a series of online talks on Christianity were run by Genexis, a Christian group that seeks to ask challenging questions about life and faith. I attended these sessions along with many other atheists, including Darren, who listeners will know from our Alpha series of reviews. This episode is part 2 of our review of the Genexis series, which covers the sessions 5 through 7. I think there are people itching to dive in on those comments. It would have been murder.
Yeah.
Let's just run with the intro and hammer this. I've got a page and a half of notes here.
Okay. I think I've got a page of notes.
Yeah, I just couldn't stop typing. Right, and now we've just had Genexis session 5 on consciousness, and this was run by Andy Bannister. So it's Darren and myself, Matthew. We were both on the course, we're both on the session rather. We did our groups, we did our questions, we listened to Andy, and now we're just going to have our 20 minutes or so of rundown on that. So, Darren, thoughts on what Andy presented?
I think it is the gold standard on how not to argue for consciousness.
Yeah, although I would expand that and I would say it's the gold standard of how not to argue whatever your position is, full stop.
Right. Yeah, it was pretty much one big straw man. Assertions, begging the question. I mean, it's even worse than what you get with most arguments.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, what this did was this showed what happens. This was a demonstration of what happens when you build a career on apologetics and spend a huge chunk of your life with an audience of your apologetics work with an audience who is cheering you on. I'm going to go really cruel here and say it's the Trump syndrome. You know, when you surround yourself with cheering fans and say the stuff that they want to hear, they're going to cheer you on. And you're going to be encouraged to say the things that they want to hear. Now, let's actually be honest and cut Andy a break here. He has argued with atheists. He has discussed with atheists. He's done this on Unbelievable and other podcasts as well. But he's still really telling the line that the Christians buy. And he's not really changed his line according to the criticism that he's getting from atheists.
Yeah, he can't. He is either incredibly dishonest or he is just not having honest conversation with other people, one or the other.
Yeah.
Because there's no way you can have an honest conversation with an atheist and then come out with what he was saying today.
Yeah, I was disappointed that. And the first comment I made in the small group when we had it was it really necessary for him to spend 90% of that talk that he did bashing atheists before getting to the bit the sell at the end? And everybody on the group nodded in agreement. The Christians in the group expressed their disappointment at the format of that session.
Yeah, the first thing I said when I went in was, I told my group, you know what, this is not how you argue. This whole thing is one big straw man.
Yeah. So shall we walk through some of his key points about atheism and see if we can, for the sake of our dear listeners, pick up on the things that Andy said that we object to the most and why we object to them?
Sure.
So let me go through my notes, just browsing through my notes, because some of the things he said were interesting. I think early on he dropped this thing about a thought and asked a question about thought and said it is about something other than itself, which I'd not really thought about what thinking is, because it's a intriguing thing to run with. But I was okay with his description of a thought. He waxed lyrical about consciousness being the amazing thing that it is, as is thinking and those kinds of mental processes that we do in our brain. He said, and he quoted somebody talking about a bat and said, we have our consciousness as it is in ourselves, but we have very limited, if at all, capability of knowing what consciousness is or what the conscious experience is for another person, and even harder for another creature. We have no idea what a bat experiences as consciousness. So those are definitely interesting challenges. I don't think they take an argument either way because we don't know the information about them. So there's nothing to conclude from those. But I think this was part of his strategy of laying an underground of is a problem for materialism, therefore something that's not material.
Yeah, he did that a lot. And then most of the things that he said were a problem for materialism wasn't actually a problem for materialism. Um,
Yes.
I mean, just this whole idea of like his example for the truth for survival. I mean, this is planting his ridiculous argument that you can't get reliable truth determining cognitive faculties from an evolutionary process. And in this example, he used the story of a saber-toothed tiger. You know, two people are running away from a saber-toothed tiger. Okay, well, they know that the truth is that if they don't run away from the saber-toothed tiger, they're going to get eaten. And he seemed to completely gloss over that whole
Hmm.
truth creating evolutionary
Yes.
trait. Because if the guy doesn't run away from the saber-toothed tiger, he's going to get eaten and he's not going to be able to pass on his genes. That is
Yep.
a truth that you are getting from the evolutionary process.
Yes, exactly. And in his example, he used example of two men that run away from the saber-toothed tiger, but one runs away because he's afraid of being eaten. The other one runs away because he thinks the tiger needs exercise. Now, even if we take that to be, let's expand on that. The one that thinks that the tiger needs exercise might run in a different way to the one that wants to run away, because the one that wants to run away because he wants to survive won't just run. He'll find somewhere to hide. He'll find a strategy to defend himself against a saber-toothed tiger. Whereas the person who's just running in order to give it exercise will just run because that's his reason for running, to give it exercise. He's not going to climb a tree. He's not going to hide in a cave, and he's not going to come up and defend himself. He's going to run. And eventually he's going to be eaten, and he's going to be eaten more times than the guy that wants to save himself. Therefore, evolution is going to select the truth out of those two options.
Right. And he's not always going to run. Sometimes he's going to try throwing a stick.
Yeah.
You know?
Fetch.
It's yeah, it's one of those things that they really have to stretch this out to try to make it work. And it's like they don't think through their arguments at all. I mean, we had what, 2 minutes to think about this?
Hmm.
And I'm guessing as he was telling the story, you were like, oh, well, this.
Yeah. So they come up with an analogy, and on face value, the analogy looks like it might be a problem. So they explain why it is a problem and then move on. They don't actually unpack the argument to its full conclusions. They don't run a simulation on the argument to see if it actually really works, like we've just done and shown, oh, actually, maybe it doesn't really work. It's just here's the analogy, here's why it's a problem. Both they go, atheism defeated. Let me show you again how I'm going to defeat it. And it's just this one after the other, after the other, after the other, without actually thinking them through properly to their final conclusion.
And he actually has a motivation for atheists. Did you catch that at the very beginning of why we're trying to push this materialistic agenda on them?
I did see that. I mean, several people in the group noticed that it was the very narrow materialistic form of atheist that he was attacking. And the
Well, no,
Christians
but
in the group said there are other types of atheists besides those that are just raw materialists.
right, but did you catch the motivation he gave for us?
I don't remember.
At the very beginning, he was saying that neuroscientists are trying to get rid of God.
Oh, yes, that was the Churchlands one. Paul and Patricia Churchland, you mentioned them and said that they are working hard to eliminate God.
Yeah, it's like, why would we care about your God?
Yeah, I just care about what the conclusions are from the evidence that we can validate. And if that does actually show that there is a God or something other, then if that's what the satisfactory evidence shows, then I will have no choice but to accept it. You know, my motivation isn't to eliminate God. My motivation is to find what is true as best I can from the evidence that's available. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did miss that.
Yeah, and he went through a lot of what the atheists were saying at the very beginning, and all of it was, oh, look at how bleak this worldview is. Isn't Christianity so much nicer? We should believe Christianity because it's so much nicer.
So why is it okay for us to accept a materialistic world?
Because that's what's been demonstrated to be true. You know, as soon as a theist, and this is to anyone who happens to be the audience, any one of you who can demonstrate the supernatural or the non-material as a real thing, I will no longer be a materialist. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and that was the question that I submitted. Obviously, there were lots of questions, so they didn't all get read out, but that was the question I submitted. How can I validate what is beyond the material? If you've got a way of me doing that, I will gladly do the test. I've been asking it for quite some time. Every time I get embroiled into this kind of conversation with Christians, that is my go-to question. Submit your test, dear listeners, reasonpress@gmail.com, and I will happily do the test to the best of my ability. Now, one of the other things that Andy brought up was the Chinese room analogy. I'm assuming that you're familiar with it.
Oh, yeah,
Darren.
it's the stupidest thing.
I like the analogy. It's a fun analogy. So briefly for the listeners, the Chinese room analogy is where you've got a person who's locked inside of a room. He doesn't know Chinese, but he's presented with a grid of translation from one Chinese symbol to another Chinese symbol. And his purpose is he gets fed a piece of paper into the room, which has a series of Chinese symbols on it. And he uses his lookup grid to write the next set of Chinese letters on it, symbols on it, and then passes that back out the room. And the people on the outside of the room think they're having a conversation, but they're not having a conversation. They're having a conversation with a process, not an intelligent human being. And so the challenge here is can computers do this? If we are just a material brain, and a deterministic material brain at that, then that is effectively how our brain works, which, spoiler, that isn't actually how our brain works. But the analogy suggests that that's as played here out in this session, was kind of suggesting that that's what the determinist brain is like. But the thing is, where this criticism falls over is the people outside the Chinese room are actually fooled into thinking that the contents of the Chinese room are intelligent and thinking and having a conversation with them. So it really does, if he's going to use this analogy, all he's doing is he's emphasizing the illusion of consciousness.
Well, yeah, because if people can be fooled into thinking the machine is conscious, then how did he determine that he wasn't fooled into thinking that humans weren't conscious?
Exactly. And that's the question that we've got to ask, and I accept that I am probably fooled into thinking that I am conscious, and I'm probably fooled into thinking that I have free will because that's how I behave. Does my acceptance of that fooling change the kind of person that I am? I don't flop into a meaningless bag of chemicals. I embrace the illusion and live my life as wonderfully as I can because I enjoy living my life as wonderfully as I can.
Yeah, and then the other real problem with the Chinese room is computers don't actually work like that anymore.
No.
He's putting the conclusion into the thought experiment and then claiming that the thought experiment proves the conclusion when he hard-coded the conclusion into the experiment. It's like, okay, seriously, people?
Yeah, so I was really quite disappointed by all that. And he was saying various things about materialist atheist worldview, which I have no difficulty accepting, like what we've been talking about consciousness and free will. And my response to those as being a criticism of reality are, well, it's on you to show it. I've done my due diligence by showing that these things are as they are explained materially. If you want to put something else on top of that, you really need to bring that justification to the table and present a way of us being able to validate it. Just by saying you don't like this conclusion or coming up with a straw analogy to mock that analogy, I might even laugh at it with you, but you haven't actually disproved it by having a joke about it at its expense.
And that was his biggest problem throughout this entire thing. He was making assertions left and right. This is a problem for atheists. Let's have at it. And none of it was really a problem. His examples were bad.
Yeah. And his evidence for, because it wasn't one of the questions. It was him at its end, because he only saved about the last 5 minutes for what he was trying to do for his sell job on Christianity. And I really wanted him to do a big sell job on Christianity. But, if maybe he had to preload it with all the critiques of materialism because he didn't have a lot to say on his sell job for Christianity. But it was the standard bullet point list on things that people want for Christianity to be true, which was fine-tuning, intelligent design, morality, justice, beauty, and meaning.
Yeah, as if a materialist can't have any of that.
Exactly. So, yeah, the whole morality thing, in fact, that came out of the question. So let's jump to the question. So there were 5 questions that asked. The first one was, do dogs think? So the answer spread out into non-human animals and their cognitive ability. And he was very strong on that one in saying that it's basically clear that there is no evidence that other animals have an experience of cognition and consciousness that is as great as the human
Yeah, and that's actually
experience.
just patently false. There's actually evidence that dolphins and whales have their own languages, and as like dolphins and some primates are even self-aware. And usually the first thing they check out is their tongues and their genitals
Yes.
when given a mirror.
Yeah. It's a whole dot test, isn't it? But it's interesting how this assertion here conflicts with right at the very beginning, where he was asserting that we only have the experience of our own conscious experience. We can't tap into what it's like for a bat to experience consciousness. And then he goes and says that there. So you could say technically he's right that there is no evidence that other animals have the same level of consciousness and conscious experience and cognitive ability to us. But the only reason why there is no evidence is because we're unable to grasp the nature of how we could validate any evidence or test specifically for any evidence. We can only get clues. But I would like to, on the subject of the way other animals experience consciousness and cognition with humans, I think the video that I like the best, which is a real challenge for the cognition of other animals, and that's the one of a dolphin that was caught in a net, and it found two scuba divers and presented to them the fin that was caught in the net. At least I think it did. You have to find the video to fact check that. And they started cutting it free, and then the dolphin broke free from them, went up to the surface. Clearly it needed some air, took a new breath and went back down to them, and they carried on, finished the job. Then it went back up, got some air, came back, and apparently did some kind of signal to them after it was free, and then ran off to be free. And that final signal is interpreted by many viewers as a thank you.
Yeah.
Now, surely for an animal to come back and say thank you has got to show a huge, huge amount of self-awareness, of cognition, of more than just intelligence.
Well, yeah, just the fact that it realized that it was caught in a net and that these guys could free it and that they needed time to do that. So it was coming back and forth. I mean, all of that is an indication of consciousness. And part of the problem is that no one's really ever defined consciousness. I mean, we have some vague ideas of what we mean by it, but there's no real...
Yes. It's hard to define. And just because I'm a atheist naturalistic materialist doesn't mean that I know what consciousness is. I have my idea, and my idea is that it's a glorious illusion. It doesn't mean I'm right, and it doesn't mean that I have absolute evidence for it. I don't have absolute evidence for it, but the evidence that I've seen at the moment convinces me of that, and I would love to see more evidence. What I don't see is evidence for something beyond that. And yes, it feels weird to assert the position that I'm in. And yes, it would be great if our minds were greater than that, if consciousness was a real entity, and that if free will was actually free, and then my decisions that I made were actually free. That would be a wonderful thing to be able to assert. But I don't feel that I've got any justification to assert that at all. So the next question was, what is a thought? So we covered that briefly, so I'm just going to skip through that because it was mostly a repetition of stuff that was said right at the beginning.
Yeah, we can actually view thoughts in an MRI.
Yes, that is actually a good point. And he did touch on that. He says that thoughts are a measurable thing in our brain in a reaction, but he did say there were more than just that. So what was the analogy he used was, if you picked up a book and you read a book about thinking, there's really just the presentation of itself in the book. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute, isn't the thought just a presentation of it in our material brain? I don't really see how his book analogy worked for it, a thought being more than just a thing happening in the brain. Did you get where he was going with that? Did you make sense of that?
No, because a lot of it's just assertions. Oh, yes, we can measure it in the brain, but it's more than that. And then that's sort of where he stops.
Yeah, fine. If it's more than that, find me a way of being able to validate that, please. That's really what I want to know.
Right.
Next one, what is your logical argument for consciousness from consciousness for God? So what is your logical argument from consciousness for God? And this I thought was the weakest answer. And I think this is where it shows where this whole thing was weak, trying to get to a God, not just a Christian God, but any God from consciousness as an experience is really poor, because there really isn't a lot to work on. And I think the answer to this question just exposed that.
Yeah, I was sort of tuning out by this point, so I didn't really catch it. What his answer was.
It was, he basically appealed to what worldview makes most sense of it. And this is the kind of thing that we've heard. So he was saying, what do you think
that's why
fits
I was
better?
tuning out.
Yeah. And this is something that we hear a lot, and I think probably Andrew and I probably need to try to work an episode of Still Unbelievable out of responding to this. And it was really throwing it at you. Make your own mind up. What worldview do you think makes most sense of this conclusion? I don't want that. I want something that I can validate and test, or some documentation of someone else who's done the validation and test that compels me to accept what the truth is. I don't want it to be left up to me, because if it's left up to me with my faulty brain, I'll probably make the wrong choice somewhere down the line. I want some evidence that compels me to accept what the evidence says.
Right, and this is pretty indicative of his entire talk. Oh, atheism and materialism is so bad and bleak and everything. Christianity is happy clappy. You should come and believe us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was the point that he tried to make about if our brain is just all material processes, and we are determined to come to conclusions that we come to, which again isn't technically true, because there are past experiences as well which inform where we come to. So we're not necessarily just materially determined to get to a position. There are a whole realm of life experiences and the conclusions we come to from those life experiences that also feed in to the determined conclusion at the end. But the basic point that he was making was, under the material realm, our conclusions are determined, and therefore we can't trust the conclusions that we come to, which may technically be right, which is why we come up with processes to test our conclusions, to validate the experiments we come from. That is why we have this whole scientific methodology to counteract the inaccurate conclusions that our brains come to when left to their own devices. They shouldn't be left to their own devices. We should test them using external means, which is why we experiment in science. And yet here we have religion arriving at its own conclusions entirely within the brain. That process which is not trustworthy. The evidence that relying on just the material brain is faulty is all the plethora of different religions that we've got in the world.
Yeah. I wonder what he makes of a calculator.
Yeah.
Because it's just material. It doesn't do anything except produce truth out of it.
Well, remember, he did assert that math is because of God, so a calculator only works because God.
I guess so. Maybe God magically miracles each calculator result when someone types in a question about it to make sure it's true.
Yeah, but only if you're using a Casio. If you're using one of those other inferior calculators, it's definitely not.
Okay, it doesn't get as much God magic as the
yes,
as the Casio does. All right.
Yeah, probably.
I'll remember that the next time I need to buy a calculator.
And that really was it. There was the last question about his memories of the Peter Singer debate and Unbelievable. And I'm going to have to go and watch it now, or at least see what Peter Singer says himself, because there was this claim at the end that he actually got Peter Singer to change his mind, and Peter Singer now has changed his view on moral values and will accept that moral values exists in the same way that mathematical truths exist. I'm not really sure what that means as a sentence, to be quite honest. So I think I'm going to have to go and check out that conversation.
Yeah, but my guess is that Peter Singer and this guy doesn't actually believe that math exists in the same way. So that may be just all misleading just because they view math differently.
Yes, it could be. And if one of them believes that mathematical truths exist as a non-material entity, and the other one thinks that mathematical truths are just the way that we describe counting, then yes, they're going to be thinking different things. So I'm going to have to go and watch it and see. But it's sad to say that my opinion of Andy Bannister dropped a bit listening to this. I was really disappointed by the way he presented it. I really wanted to hear him push much more strongly and have a much higher proportion of positives for Christianity. But all he did was bash atheism and then say right at the end, oh, by the way, Christianity is true. And I just can't respect that style of delivering. And there's probably half a dozen listeners saying here, but you just do exactly the opposite there with Christianity. Maybe, but I think I've actually done a really good job of selling materialism. I hope we've done a good sell on why materialism should be taken seriously. We'll have to see. Listeners, do you agree? And we've got him back again next week.
Oh, God, shoot me now.
I know. I'm pretty sure that's what they were saying. He's back on next week talking about something else.
Yeah, morality.
Yeah.
And I bet you anything, it's going to be the same bullshit that, morality can't be explained under naturalism, even though we have thousands of years of natural epistemology that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, great.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Just stock up on the beers for next week then, Darren.
I don't drink.
Do you not? Oh,
I never drank in college, so I never got a taste for it. So.
Oh, right. Okay.
Now it just tastes gross. So I don't even have that to look forward to.
Oh, dear. There isn't even a spirit or something you can be tempted into.
No. Maybe I'll figure out how to make a fuzzy navel where I don't taste the alcohol or something.
Yeah. Or just stick a straw right at the back of your throat and take it down in one hit.
Well, maybe I'll just hit my head with a frying pan a few times until I'm...
Yeah. I think there was a time when vodka and enemas were all on vogue.
Sadly, that might sound better than listening to him on... Even with all the burning that would happen.
I know. I'm just not attracted to that idea whatsoever.
Oh, God.
Right.
And I've had so much stupid lately that I can't even be polite about it anymore.
Oh, we're going to be documenting the decline of Darren. I apologise for putting you through it all. Right. Well, with that said, I really need to pop off. So thanks again, Darren, and we'll catch you next Monday.
Yeah, have fun.
All right. Cheers. Bye. Hello, and this is Matthew and Darren, and we're reviewing session 6 of the Genexis course. So this one is Andy Bannister again, who did consciousness last week for session 5. We're now talking about good, evil, and morality. So that's just finished. It's Darren and I on the call together for a quick shoot about on what we thought about that. So Darren, what did you think?
I wasn't really impressed. There were a lot of strawmanning and not really understanding what the atheist position is and making claims about atheists that, as an atheist, I didn't recognize at all.
Yeah.
I'm not even entirely sure how he got there. So Andy seems like a really nice guy, pleasant, knowledgeable in his spheres of influence. I just don't think that atheism is inside his sphere of influence.
Yeah, I had not quite exactly, but close enough that it makes a little difference. And it was the same format as last week as well. The vast majority of his talk was saying these are things that atheists say, do, or believe, and they're all wrong. And then right at the end it was, and here's Christianity to the rescue.
Right. And he even brought up like Sam Harris and didn't even, what he was saying, Sam Harris has never actually said.
Right.
So it was pretty clear that even though he brought up Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, he never actually read it.
Well, at least if he did, what he pulled out from it isn't really an accurate representation of what Sam says.
Right.
I didn't actually write down what it was that he attributed to Sam. Did you manage to record that?
Yeah, let me look at my notes here. Because he was saying that Sam says that science can tell us what is right and wrong. And Sam doesn't actually say that. Sam says that we can use science to discover what is right and wrong, but that's only after you've decided what your goal for your definition of morality is.
Okay, so we've got some nuance there that was clearly missed.
Well, it's important nuance because his
Yes.
entire presentation on why science can't doesn't tell us anything about morality completely missed the point. So
Yeah, and that's really disappointing that somebody of this philosophical caliber in the Christian arena would miss something like that. And I'm going to stick with this because this was under the banner of which he said was how atheists try to explain morality, and this was under the headline of morality as a product of science. And the Christians in my group even thought that that whole premise was bunk.
yeah,
That nobody says that science is the source of morality or morality comes from science. Now they all accept that there are tools within science that we can use to describe things, including what we view as moral and what we view as not moral, and maybe describe how we get there. But all of them were completely lost, Christians and atheists in my group. All of us were completely lost on where he was trying to go with this whole idea of morality being a product of science. It just
yeah.
completely misses.
Yeah, and he did the same thing with evolution, although the evolution thing can be a little bit more forgiven a little bit more, but only because every Christian gets that wrong.
Yes, and you went straight for the evolution can't explain altruism,
And yet it can.
and yet it can. Yes, I know. I was sitting there listening to it, and I thought, really, is this really where he goes? There is stacks of material written about this. Is he really this confident? How can he really be this confident in what he's saying here when there are stacks and stacks and stacks of books that have evolutionary described many behaviors, and altruism is one of them.
Yeah, yeah, and for some reason, when theists talk about evolution and morality, they seem to think that when an atheist or naturalist is describing how evolution produces the structures in our brain that govern our morality, that we're somehow saying that evolution gives us moral precepts. And it's just a bizarre, I mean, maybe it's just because, I don't know, maybe they've just never had it explained to them other than from an apologist, so they don't understand what the distinction is, or I don't know. I,
Yeah,
I
and
don't I don't get that.
it is, and he did let that slip as it was a huge doozy. I noticed it right towards the end of the question session where he was talking about evolution, and these are subtle slips of the tongue, or maybe they're not, maybe they're intentional. But let's give some credit out here. It's a very subtle slip of the tongue, and many people might not notice it. People like you and I notice it and we go, hang on a minute. But the bigger problem is people who are questioning evolution or are primed to question evolution and looking for things to continue denying and questioning evolution will pick up the things that he said and go, see, this is why we can't believe evolution. And what he said was, if you rerun the script of evolution, you still won't get morality. And evolution isn't a script. Calling evolution a script implies that there's a set number of steps which will always happen, and that isn't the case. It's
Right.
not the case at all. And so this kind of loose analogous language really helps to fuel misunderstandings in evolution and how evolution works.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I don't get, I'm moving away from the evolution science talk, is how do they expect God to answer any of the questions that they raise from this? Because he was, at the very beginning, he was talking about, who gets to define good. Well, and
Mhm.
then he's saying, well, the only thing the atheist can say is, well, why should we care about your definition? And then he gives a definition of good that says that God is the founding of good without actually defining what good is.
Yeah.
And then the question is, okay, so why should we care that you're defining good as grounded in God's nature?
Hmm.
I mean, how did you determine that God's nature is good, and why should we care? So they seem to think that there's all these huge problems in, I don't want to call it atheistic morality because there's no such thing, but non-God morality that has all these big conundrums in inescapable problems, and yet they never describe how their God solution solves any of those problems.
Yeah, or even how it works. And that's the question that I think interests me the most, is what is the mechanism by which this God of theirs communicates these moral questions onto us?
Right, and then it's even before that. Why should we even care if he can?
Mm.
I mean, this is the same God that in the Bible said to stone a person to death for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. You know, uh, sack entire cities and kill all the babies and infants and everything, including the animals. Taking the virgin girls as sex slaves. Why should we care what this God has to say about morality?
It's funny you should say that, because pretty much all the Christians in my group, when we talked about what Andy had been saying about God being a source of morality, etc., pretty much all the Christians, certainly those that spoke up, said that they have issues with the Old Testament God. One of them even said, but God isn't always good.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
and
so
even when Andy gave examples of bad things that Islam was doing, like making women second-class citizens in slavery, did he not know that that's actually prescribed in his own holy book?
yeah.
Does he not know that? Is he expecting his audience not to know that? I mean, I just don't get it.
There's this mirror blindness. Well, I don't know even that's a phrase, but it's a phrase I'm going to make up right now. He points at atheism or Islam or something else and says, look at all the stuff that you're doing wrong. Look how bad and wicked you are. I'm so much better. Completely ignoring that he has exactly the same faults.
Yeah. Projection, I think, is what it's called.
Yeah. I'm going to call it mirror blindness. It sounds cool.
Actually, I like it. Mirror blindness. It's
Mirror,
actually very descriptive and
yeah.
artistic. I like it.
There we go. You heard it here, folks. Here first, folks. So what I need to do now is invent a premise for a book so I can fit that phrase into it.
Oh, right about Genexis. You had a
Yeah,
still unbelievable podcast. Still
yes,
not Genexis.
still on Genexis. At least I know it's a word that's not going to be in the dictionary, so there's going to be no problems with the domain name on that one.
Right.
So I'd like to rewind up a bit, though, and it's possibly going to cover ground that we've literally just covered. But it's when he was talking about Penn because I really do want to pull out this thing that Penn mentioned. And it was the famous phrase of Penn where he talks about he is asked, without God, what is to stop him from raping and murdering all the people that he wants, to which the response is, but I do, and the number that I want is none.
Right.
And Andy's response to that was, but Penn is assuming that not raping is good. And so the challenge and the question to respond to that is, who gets to decide that? So the response that I want to say to that is, actually, Penn didn't assume that not raping was good. The person who asked him the question was the one who was making the assertion that not raping is good. Penn just affirmed that he doesn't want to rape anyone, and so he doesn't. Penn's made no statement whatsoever about whether or not that was good. He just said that's his preference and he doesn't do it. The person who's assuming that it's good is the person who's asking the questions. That's the pushback I'd like to put back onto Andy and anyone else who uses that line of questioning. But if we really want to have that conversation, there's a whole thing about autonomy here. And the reason why Penn doesn't do it is not because he says not raping is good. The reason why he doesn't do it is because he has empathy with the person that he's looking at. He recognizes what they want and what they don't want. And he can tell and he can recognize that a woman generally doesn't want a man to treat her that way. And so he doesn't treat a woman that way. He doesn't need to ask the question about whether what it is that he's not going to do is good or bad. He just needs to have the decency and the compassion to be able to recognize what it is that the other person would or wouldn't like.
Yeah, you sort of have to wonder, do Christians actually understand what empathy is?
Yeah.
When they ask questions like, how can an atheist be good without God? Do they really need some sort of dictator telling them
Yeah.
what good and evil is?
Yeah, that scares me. That does. And I think Penn is the larger quote from Penn does go into that point And I really wanted to say it in the group that I was in as well, but the opportunity didn't come up. But yeah, if people need that kind of thing in order to be able to not treat people badly, then I worry about their character.
Yeah. And why would God want to surround himself with people like that? I mean, if you're creating a species and you've got this great toy and you're going to be inviting some of them up to spend eternity with you, do you really want the people that are only being good because you're telling them to be?
Yeah. But I'm willing to bet that if you're to ask those Christians, point out somebody to them and say, what's to stop you following her home and raping her? They're not going to say, oh, because God might watch me. They're going to give an explanation that involves not being a dick, actually treating people with respect. They're going to use that kind of language. And then, so the response is, okay, so your morality is secular then?
Yeah, maybe. I think maybe it's because we live in different cultures, but I think you're a lot more optimistic about that particular statement than I am.
Okay, we need to find a way to do this as an exercise. Maybe that's the question that Andrew and I need to start introducing to Christians when we have them on the episode. Not ask them something novel like, who's your favorite Bible character? Maybe the question you need to ask is, you see a pretty woman on the street, what stops you raping them? Maybe we'd get fewer Christians on the show if that became our standard question. Sorry, I don't mean to make rape into a joke. That's not what I'm doing. I'm very conscious that I'm talking about rape and then laughing. It's not a laughing matter.
No, the rape isn't, but trying to watch Christians do mental gymnastics around that question will be.
Yep. And George chuckle when he listens to this, so we'll have to work out a way of doing it. There was a lot of talk around in my group about this, and generally, because most of the people in my group, I say Christians and atheists alike, were unimpressed with last week, and were mostly unimpressed with this. We had some good chats around. We were all pretty much on the same page in my group as well. We pretty much all agree with the same things, and we all affirm that there is a societal influence in morality as well. So we ought to come to that back to that quickly. So is that how the conversation went in your group?
Not really. Well, sort of. Mostly it was just them badgering me, trying to figure out how I justified morality. They did, and then it ended on the idea that if I created a race of AI, I can basically do whatever I want with them because I would own them just like God owns us. So
Interesting. Yeah, we didn't get to that one. That was one other point that I wanted to pick up, because we have heard Christians say, I believe even Justin Briley might have said it on his own Unbelievable show, but somebody fact checked me on that, God being, God and the creator of us, he gets to choose how he treats us, and it is purely up to him. And so it is not on us to be able to be so arrogant as to call how he treats us immoral.
yeah, that's basically what the Christian means when they say that morality is grounded in God. They either mean because he created us and he can do whatever he wants with us, or they mean because if we don't, he's gonna torture us for all eternity. But somehow it's always he's got the biggest stick, so he can do whatever he wants with us. And given that they always criticize might makes right whenever they're criticizing secular morality, it's another mirror blindness that they've got going there.
Yeah, it is. That's a very disappointing thing to hear, and I don't think anybody in my group would have endorsed that, which I'm quite relieved by. So
You'd be surprised.
Yeah, maybe people prefer to stay a little bit quiet about it. But then if they keep quiet about it, it's because they recognise that it's not actually an argument that works very well. Yeah. Certainly not at convincing those who aren't already on their side.
Yeah, all you have to do is ask them, okay, so how does God ground morality? And they may take a little circuitous route to get there, but it always comes back to somehow that God owns us and we're his property.
Yeah. Yes, basically. So there's one more thing that I wanted to pick up, and I think was an own goal by Andy in this talk about morality and trying to ground morality in God. And while he didn't say it explicitly, I definitely got the impression from his talk that morality in God is unchanging. It's always the same. And morality, therefore, the rules of morality, what is good, what is bad, doesn't change. And of course, slavery came up as part of that, and don't need to have to be a genius to know that the history of slavery is that slavery was introduced, and then there was a great big fight, and slavery came out of it, and that's brushing over it very quickly. But the idea is society changed its view of slavery. That's actually not strictly true, actually. There were people who agreed with slavery and there were people who disagreed with slavery, and there was a long, long battle before the people that disagreed with slavery eventually got their way. But even after that deal was done and slavery got banned, those who still thought slavery was good very probably still thought slavery was good. But what happened was society changed due to societal pressure. People saw something they didn't want to represent them, and so they did something about it. It's unfortunate that it took as long as it did to abolish slavery, but that's a completely different story. And this completely backs up the whole point of society having an influence on what is accepted as moral. Because those people who thought slavery was right when they were fighting for it and reluctantly gave up on it, they didn't last around very long, and the generation after them agrees that slavery is wrong. Their children and their children's children, we all agree that slavery is wrong now. And so this is complete and utter evidence for morality, human morality, being in part, at least, a product of our societal influences. And Andy tried to bring it up because at least one Christian was involved in fighting it, forgetting, of course, that there were also non-Christians who were involved in fighting against slavery, Charles Darwin being one of them. And this completely goes against the entire point that Andy was trying to make, and he seemed to be completely oblivious to it.
Yeah, that's same thing sort of happened with over here, because everyone wants to say that Christians were the ones that abolished slavery in the United States. They always seem to forget that the people the Christians and non-Christians were fighting against were Christians that were using the Bible to justify slavery.
Yeah.
And it took a war and a lot of death to get those Christians to stop having slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you go back to the literature of the time, there is never any Bible verses that are invoked for against slavery. All the Bible verses and everything, the Bible was always invoked to endorse slavery. I don't know. I just don't get how they can be just so blind to the obvious about that, because morality is always completely objective until it's obvious that it's bad morality, and then it was, oh well, that was just God, speaking to them at the time, or there's a deeper meaning to this. That's one thing that in my group is I brought up the passage where God commanded someone to be killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and they were all over themselves, just twisting themselves into knots to be, oh well, it wasn't really death, and he was we're supposed to get the meaning out of that. So sort of, why would be, working on the Sabbath be a bad thing for us, or the consequences for us might be bad. And not a single one of them addressed the actual text that says God commanded this guy to be put to death. The people were like, are you sure, God, you really want to do this? And God says, yes, I told you what to do. Put the little shit to death, take him out back, stone him to death, and then come back. And so that's what they did.
Final question then, was there anything in this that would have made you stop and think maybe there's more to morality than the blind absurdity that we have in naturalism?
No, because I don't think we have a blind absurdity in naturalism. I think that's just a thing that Christians say because they don't want to think about it too deeply. So they think they can just dismiss it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Morality under atheism was described as absurd on multiple points, and I completely disagree. I don't see how that description fits at all. It's different to what it is that Christians would affirm. I completely agree with that. And it could well be that Christians have so been brought up on the Christian ideals of morality that they can't see and can't understand how morality under a godless world works, and therefore they see it as absurd. But
Yeah.
my challenge to Christians is, please pay a bit of attention. Come and engage.
Yeah, and don't make assumptions about the atheist worldview because you're going to get it wrong. And then we spend half the conversation just trying to correct you and not being able to correct you because you think you already have it.
Yes, if you're going to come on and talk to us about morality, dear Christian, please don't come on with the attitude of you absolutely do have all the questions, and all you need to do is shout at us at the right volume, and we'll get it. Let's actually have a dialogue, and let's engage in our differences and see where we go from there. Because the thing that I think I need to say, let's just try and say something in defence of the Christians here, because we have been quite I was going to say brutal. We could have been a lot more brutal, but we've been a little bit rough on the Christian view of morality, and maybe justly so, but that's for somebody else to answer. So I'm going to just give the Christian a little bit of leeway here, because I have lived life as a Christian, and I always say that my exit from Christianity, the hardest part of that journey was my realignment of morality, not because I had to work out how to not be a bad person, but I had to unpick the lie that morality comes from an all-present, ever-living being. It doesn't. And I had to readjust and realize that actually morality is within us. It is our DNA, and it is about us. It is part of society, and there's a complex mixture there. And so I get it that it's really, really, really difficult for some Christians to get how a godless life can have any kind of morality. But it is true that does exist. It is very, very possible, and also surprisingly very, very easy for a godless life to have a wonderful morality. We don't need a God. And I understand that if you're a Christian listening to this, that it's difficult to comprehend. I understand that a Christian trying to grapple with it might struggle. I get that because I've been there. But please don't tell us that we're wrong. Engage with the ideas that we have, because there is a beautiful, wonderful life to be had outside of a God, and we don't need a God in order to be good.
And I would add on to that, if you're a Christian and you firmly believe that you have a better morality because you have a God, I fully endorse that you go and listen to the deconversion stories of theist to atheists. And there's podcasts out there dedicated just to that. I can think of 3 just off the top of my head. But go out, find them, because almost universally, whenever an atheist starts talking about, that was a Christian, starts talking about their deconversion and their change of morality, I have yet to find anyone who says that their morality is worse than when they were a Christian. They always say that they have a better morality now than when they were a Christian.
Yes, that is very true, dear Christian. And don't just say, oh, well, they would say that. Maybe that is true, but come and engage, please. Thank you, Darren. And next one is about Jesus, and we're promised evidence. You holding your breath?
Oh, no. We
We
haven't
talked
gotten
about
any
evidence in
evidence.
session 1.
I was going to say
Yeah.
since session 1, but we didn't even get it then.
So,
Ah,
yes, I'm intrigued by what's going to happen. And I've been asked the question a few times about where I stand on the whole mythicism thing. So I may have to decide this week exactly what my position is on that, because I always say I'm on the fence about mythicism. I don't have enough information to affirm that Jesus as a character as described in the Bible minus the miracles actually existed. So where do I go with that statement? And so I'm on the fence with that. So it'll be interesting to see if next week shifts me from that position. Maybe I need to find something that might help me to seek somewhere where I could plant a flag on that this week.
Yeah, my position has always been if you've got two hypotheses and the evidence presented does not distinguish between the two hypotheses, then you don't have any evidence for either one.
Yeah.
That's always been my stance. Until Christians can get their shit together, then I'm going to let them get their house in order before I make a decision.
Okay. In a week's time, we'll find out what happened with Darren and myself on that conversation. But in terms of this episode, you're probably only 30 seconds away. Until next time, see you later. Cheers, Darren. Thanks for that. And here is Darren and Matthew back again for the 7th and the final episode of the Genexis course. So this time it was about Jesus, the life of Jesus, the person of Jesus. Did he exist? The title for the course was Myths and Legends and subtitled King Arthur, St. Nicholas and Jesus. So that was the subject matter. So this is the grand finale. Everything else that we've been doing in the last 6 episodes have been basically leading up to this, because Jesus is where Christianity is centered, basically. So that's where we've landed. And this was done, in case you hadn't already guessed, by Gary Habermas. So he's also the big gun in everything, in all the presenters that we've had. So I wasn't expecting that. I was quite excited for that. So I was looking forward to this. I've never heard Gary talk explicitly like this. I've heard it in podcasts and read some of his material, but I haven't been attending anywhere where I've seen him talking live. So this was something I'd been looking forward to this week. So Darren was there. Darren has joined me. So Darren, did it deliver anything that we hoped for?
Well, apparently my standards were a lot lower than yours, but no, it didn't even reach my lower standards.
Yeah, I tell you what threw me with this. I expected him to come out running with his minimal facts, and I expected to have lots of references of internal consistency within the Gospels and within the letters of Paul, and I expected lots of that kind of thing to assure us that what's said about Jesus is actually true. But he didn't go there at all. That was saved right through to the end, and he touched on people like King Arthur, who are the names I've got down here, Alexander the Great, Buddha, and Krishna. And you talked about the scarcity of contemporary documents about their lives, and that the best quality documents that we have about their lives are often many years later. I think it's 100 or so years for Alexander the Great, 300 years actually I've got written here for Alexander the Great, 600 for Buddha, more than 4,000 for Krishna, and well, King Arthur, I don't think anybody actually takes anything about King Arthur seriously anyway. I think he's genuinely accepted to be a legend. But the point that Gary was making on King Arthur is that the stories of his life are spread over hundreds of years. And then, of course, when it comes to Jesus, the story is very, very different. So this is something that I grew up on as a Christian in my 20s. This was the kind of reasoning that many books that I read as a Christian were, that the sheer volume of contemporary documents for and about Jesus are so many. How could anyone doubt anything about Jesus? So that was really where his entire argument centered, was that even people like Bart Ehrman say that Jesus existed. So as you said, Darren, there was certainly a parry for any perceived mythicist attack, but mythicist really isn't all there is out there in the worlds of people who are not Christian.
Yeah, and it's sort of a red herring anyways, because there isn't, because he's focused on 3 or 4 atheist New Testament historians saying that they believe that Jesus existed and he did these things. The problem is that they didn't actually believe that the Jesus described in the Bible actually existed.
Yeah.
So this whole mythicism thing is sort of a red herring, because none of them believe that the Jesus of the Bible existed. They may think that there was one or more historical people that were mythicized into the stories that were presented in the Bible. And there's even 1 or 2 scholars that I'm aware of that think that the myth is all that ever existed, and there was no real man behind it. I always find it misleading when apologists start saying that, oh, these atheist scholars support the Jesus story, because they really don't. They support some guy that the stories were based on existing. That still doesn't get you to the magic happening, though.
Yes, and I think that's a very, very important part. And Gary did touch on it, but all very briefly and possibly only in one sentence. That the likes of Bart Ehrman don't accept the supernatural claims of Jesus. But he says all these things about the attestation of the claims of Jesus. And Bart apparently is among many atheist scholars who has no problem accepting that there were claims about Jesus' resurrection within only a few years of his reported death. And that may or may not be true. Let's say, for argument's sake, that those claims are true. What's happening here is the fact that there are atheists who are prepared to accept that those claims existed is used to support the authenticity of the Gospels. But that's not really what's being said here. There's a very subtle sleight of hand going on here. Just because it's accepted that these documents with these claims exist, it doesn't mean that anything that's written in these documents can be trusted.
Oh, I know. The biggest problem I have is that if you actually go in and see the reasoning behind why New Testament scholars think that Jesus died and he had followers, they had experiences and all that, it all comes back to Paul. So they all have to assume that Paul's actually being honest first in order to reach the suppositions that they're making. And if Paul's no longer a reliable source of information, all of that, all the minimal facts, arguments, everything just poofs, disappears into the ether, because all of them rely on Paul actually telling the truth. And without that, they don't have an argument.
Yes, and I really don't have enough knowledge to talk with any authority here, but that does seem to be the case. The earlier documents are the letters of Paul. The Gospels, while we might read them first, we might rely on them so much when reading the New Testament, they came after the letters of Paul. And
right,
so
but he mentioned this in the Q&A afterwards when he was asked how did he know that these things were happening, and his entire answer was, oh well, Paul said this, Paul did this because that's what Paul said he did in his writings. That's how we know James the brother and Peter and all these other people existed, because Paul visited them in Jerusalem. Well, how do we know that Paul did these things? Well, that's because that's what Paul said he did. And if you actually read the letters of Paul and you actually just read the ones that aren't considered to be forgeries, I mean, maybe it's just me, but it sounds like a con man trying to convince his public that he has authority because he's seen these other people and was able to best them, and he pwned them, and he was so much better than them, and that's how his people can know that he is the guy to listen to. So to me, that's what it sounds like. It's just a con man trying to convince his other people to believe that's what he's saying and not to believe anyone else.
I've never thought of it as a con man, but then I've taken the lazy route and I sit on the fence on so many of these issues about the Bible. So because I'm unprepared and I'm unwilling to put any kind of motivation behind what's being said. All I know is I really, really struggle to accept the claims of the supernatural. But you did mention Acts and you did mention Conman, and that immediately brought to mind a very, very subtle story. Now, I'm pretty sure it's in Acts, and I'm sure there'll be Christians who haven't really, who this will be a surprise to. There's a story about a sorcerer called Simon. I'm fairly sure it's in Acts, who was able to do great things as well, heal people, etc. But he wasn't a believer. And the story goes that he saw what the others were doing, and he thought that what they were doing was so much cooler than what he was doing. So he went and asked for their trick, their secret on how they do it. So this kind of feels like an apocryphal story about a battle of the magicians, and the winning magician is the one that got to tell the story about how this other magician thought he was so great he came to ask him how he did his tricks.
Yeah, it's like a Bronze Age internet comments section.
Yes. going back to Gary's presentation, though, it did really hinge around the fact that there's so much more information we have about Christianity, okay, and B, there are people who are not Christians who also affirm all of this other information. But as you've said, does seem to be a lot of assertion about, or rather assumption, that what is actually written is actually true, which I think is problematic in itself. And this has always been my criticism when going through the minimal facts list of Gary Habermas's, is that he just assumes that what is written in his minimal facts, the claims behind them, are accurate, and then goes hunting for ways to justify why people would do that. For example, the disciples being martyred. Maybe that happened, maybe that didn't. That's written, but if it really did happen, then that adds some credence to what they believed, apparently. And so let's believe that what is written about the apostles and the disciples being martyred is true. Now let's go and try and justify why that should be true. And I think that's the problem there. I think the deeper question needs to be, can we even trust some of the things that are being written? And I think that's the question that hasn't been answered.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure how you answer that, given that we don't have any real evidence for any of it actually happening, and then the supernatural stories sort of point to it not happening because no one's actually been able to demonstrate the supernatural is a real thing.
Yes, I absolutely agree. We've already talked about miracles over on our Alpha series, and we've really hammered home about we just don't see miracles happening today. And because we don't see miracles happening with any kind of reliability today, why should we believe that they happened with any kind of reliability 2,000 years ago? And if we can't accept that, then there's a whole load of passages in the New Testament and in the Gospels and in Acts and the letters of Paul, which we really can't accept because there's no justification for these supernatural events. And as soon as you take the supernatural events out of it, well, you're left with a collection of stories which have been embellished, possibly fabricated, but we don't know what's been embellished. We don't know what's been fabricated. We don't really know the truth from the fiction. So why should we trust any of it? And that's really where my rabbit hole goes.
Well, and that's what historians actually do. When historians come across supernatural claims, they dismiss them out of hand. That's why historians don't say Caesar was the son of a Greek god, because whenever there's supernatural claims like that, they just dismiss them out of hand.
That's
how
quite a reasonable thing to say, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how you know that when Christians start saying there's historical evidence for the supernatural, that they're just uninformed about what historical evidence actually is.
Yeah, I think when we have these conversations with Christians, and I'm hoping that at some day I will be able to have this kind of conversation with a Christian, the definition of what is meant by the phrase historical evidence really needs to be nailed down, because when that phrase is thrown around in these kinds of conversations, I'm often fairly sure that what the Christian means by historical evidence isn't necessarily what I mean by historical evidence.
Yeah, explanatory power is the one for me that I really would like to have nailed down. As far as I can tell, it just means whatever story they can make up that supports their preferred narrative has the explanatory power.
Yes, and then we get into the realm of, well, what's the best explanation for all these facts? And it's like, oh, hang on a minute, we haven't established their facts yet.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the main problem in a lot of these Christian arguments, is they are jumping ahead. They're assuming things that aren't evidenced, and they're asking us to explain things they haven't demonstrated are real. And it's sort of hard to have a conversation like that, because you're wanting to, because I always find myself wanting to slow down and say, hey, well, how did you determine that the supernatural is even a real thing and capable of doing this type of stuff?
I know.
They want to push on to, oh, well, we've got, you have an empty tomb. Can you show me this empty tomb? How did you know this was the tomb that Jesus used?
Yeah.
It's just
quite, just because we can walk around the geography of the area and recognize some of the places that are described in the Gospels, that still doesn't mean that the amazing events that are described actually happened. We need to have some realistic context in what's being being said and what's being seen.
Yeah, and I think the best argument against it actually ever having happened is that Jews still exist.
Mm,
The people that were actually there, actually in the area, observing what was supposedly happening, who was actually looking for the Son of God, their next Messiah, they didn't buy the story, you
yeah.
know? And I think that says more than any, minimal facts argument because people are assuming things based on stories they can't verify actually happened.
Mm. And that's a very, very good point. There was
Right.
there was something else I wanted to say. It's gone. Oh yes, there was. The other thing is we also know that people who wrote about people years ago, biographers, they didn't write to the same standard as biographers do today. The standard of integrity and attention to detail and getting facts right really wasn't as high 2,000 years ago as it is now. And people looking back at these ancient documents often say that it was quite normal for a biographer to just invent whole passages of fiction when writing a story about somebody's life. They didn't
Oh, yeah.
know about something that happened in somebody's life. There was a gap of a few years, or nobody survived a battle. So they would just create an entire narrative right out of their own mind about what happened, because it was so much easier to do that than it was to put in the effort of going and trying to find people, because it wasn't a case of make a few phone calls. It was walk for days to find someone and go, oh no, he lives over there, so walk a few more days, and it was actually hard work for people in that time to go and track people down to have these conversations. And so things were
Mhm.
made up. And let's
Yeah.
accept that, let's acknowledge that that is true. There
Yeah.
are narratives about people, some which are believed, which are utter fiction. And sometimes it's just not possible when you look at the document to tell the difference between what is based in reality and what is utter fiction. And let's be brave and let's be honest and let's just say the same could very well be true of Jesus in the Gospels.
Yeah, a lot of history was the same way. Like Josephus, he talks about Romulus and Hercules as if they were real people.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
he's
And
held up
it's,
as extra biblical evidence because he talks about Jesus as if he was a real person as well.
I know, but the bit in Josephus that's written about Jesus is only a small section, and when you stick it in with all this other stuff, which is some is true and some isn't, how can we trust that what is written?
Well, yeah, and there's most of consensus in the academic sphere is that the passages about Jesus weren't even actually there to begin with, or at least most of it wasn't. There's still some argument about the rest of it, but most of it they all recognize wasn't even there when Josephus wrote it.
Yeah, the Christian leader in my small group did actually offer that information himself. I wasn't confident enough in it to be able to suggest it, but he said, yeah, there are some people who are suggesting that Jesus bit is a forgery that's been inserted.
Yeah, and there's argument about how much of it was inserted, but it reads a lot better if that entire paragraph is, or it reads more like Josephus if that entire paragraph is just removed.
Okay, so there's a challenge to listeners. If you question what we're saying about Josephus, go read that passage, then take out the Jesus bit and read it again. Does it make more sense? Feed us back, reasonpress@gmail.com. So was there anything else that came out of this presentation? How did your small group discussion go?
They were fairly incensed at me because I brought up the fact that all the supposed evidence would be the exact same if Paul had made everything up. Everything would look exactly the same. And so they were arguing against that.
I think it's true, and it's also true for events that we know. If you can't tell the difference between something being true and something being completely invented, just think a little bit more critically about what it is that you're being told. I told a small story from my own family life, which I have already told here on this podcast in various other episodes. And every time I tell this, Christians are always very sympathetic to me, to the experiences of the story, and horrified that a story has been warped this way. But I use it to try to point out that this kind of thing can happen with Jesus. And so I'll tell it very, very briefly, because I'm sure you've already heard it as well, Darren. This is a story about my mother being kidnapped in Zambia in the late 70s, in the run-up to the independence notification of Zimbabwe. So she was kidnapped along with a few other people, two other people actually, from the farm that were living on. They were all beaten. They all suffered terribly. It was effectively torture that they had. And there was negotiation with the Zambian police, and they were eventually released. There was more stuff going on, but you don't really need to know the gory details of that. When it came to her funeral 30 years later, the story was that when they were kidnapped, the church got news of the kidnapping. They had a hastily rushed together prayer meeting, and there was a clap of thunder or a storm or something, and the people who'd kidnapped them got petrified and had let them free. And the whole prayer meeting, the storm, the people getting scared and letting them free, it's all straight out lie. I have no idea how this lie got inserted into the narrative of my mother's kidnapping, but within 30 years, within a lifetime, a story of brutal torture, beating, as in a kidnap scenario, got changed into a kidnap scenario, no reference to torture and beating, and a glorious rescue with the help of God. So if that can happen that easily in today's world, dear Christian, is it such a stretch to imagine that things like that can also happen 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Considering we have historical evidence of it happening within 1 to 4 years.
Yeah, quite. In fact, to go even more recent, we've got the whole 9/11 stuff. Look at all the conspiracies and people rolling out, inverted commas, evidence about mini nukes and all sorts of other stuff that brought the Twin Towers down in New York on that terrible, terrible day.
That didn't even take a week.
No, they didn't. Those stories were floating out, and then you had school shootings in the decade after that, and within a day, people are going over the video footage from the news items saying, "Oh, these people are actors. Look, here they are elsewhere." And those kind of things. So, if people really want to, they will come up with a different narrative over true events in a very short space of time. Really, do we really have to accept that the gospel stories of Jesus are actually what happened? I suggest not. Anything else you want to say, Darren?
No, I think my very first prediction about this series was that Paul went over, took the entire first episode talking about evidence, and then we didn't see any evidence at all in any of the following 6 episodes. So I think that's 1 point for me.
That's a good link back to the beginning. It would be really nice if the things that were laid out in that very first episode about evidence, because we both said that we really liked that part of that first episode. If some of the presenters had watched that and lined up some stuff that could be presented in a similar format to that kind of evidence, that would really make me stop and think. That would really make me go, okay, this is something I genuinely need to look into. And unfortunately, we haven't had that evidence that's challenged me, that's made me go, oh, yes, this matches that pattern that we were described back in episode 1. That's really what I would like to hear, like to have. So if you're a Christian listening to this, you think that Darren and I are completely wrong, come and have a conversation. Drop us an email. We'll try and have a conversation. We'll get something together and we'll work out a way of having a conversation and deciding some of these terms that we've used, about what evidence is, what historical evidence actually means, what the best explanation actually means, and why we can or can't trust what is written in the Gospels. Just one quick other thing for me to say is, the first question I got asked in my small group from one of the Christians was, what is the atheist position on Jesus? I had to smile inwardly on that, because my first thought was, well, there isn't really an atheist position. I know I've seen this in other places before. It's atheists believe this about Jesus, which isn't true. There are many different brands of atheists. So I very briefly said there are some atheists which are complete extreme mythicists, and there are some atheists which are very happy to endorse all the natural things that Jesus did, that he was definitely a single preacher going around doing these things, but somehow all the supernatural stuff got added in. And then there's people who are somewhere in between, that it was multiple people and the stories come from different sources, etc. So there is a whole long range. And I said I sit somewhere in the middle. I'm unprepared to commit to any of those because I don't have enough information. Question to you, Darren. Are you prepared to state where you sit on the mythicist to real person scale?
Not really. My big thing is that, as far as the mythicism goes, is that there's not enough information to tell either way. And when your mythicist hypothesis, just as likely as the magic Jesus hypothesis, or the non-magic Jesus hypothesis that has grown into myth, if all the evidence we have equally supports all three positions, then I'm not entirely sure how you make it come to a conclusion.
Yeah, that's probably why I'm in the same position. I'm not prepared to come to conclusion, and my justification for that is I just can't tell the difference. I don't think there's enough information. And as you say, if all three positions are supported by the evidence, then clearly the evidence either isn't good enough or there isn't enough of it.
Depending on your definition of evidence, it makes the statement there is no evidence for it kind of true.
Yes, it does. We need to find a way of being able to boil the truth out of what we've got left, really.
Yeah.
That's the end of that. On behalf of the listeners, thank you, Darren, for your time in doing this. I do appreciate it. I don't know if there'll be another one of these. Listeners, if you know of any similar kind of courses that are being run for investigating Christianity, please let me know, and I'll do what I can do to get on, and we'll do some kind of review of it. If you've appreciated what we've done, please let me know. I absolutely need your justification and I need your validation. Please, I'm that insecure. But being seriously, any feedback is good feedback. If you want to challenge some of the things that we've said and come on and talk to us about what we've said wrong so that we can improve next time, absolutely welcome that conversation, because I really don't want to be talking into a bubble. And that's really the end of that. Final thoughts, Darren, on all that we've done, because you've done Alpha with us as well?
Well, it strikes me that between Alpha, Genexis, the 15 or 20 years of apologetics that I've been looking at, it strikes me that this lack of evidence for their position just gets more and more obvious as time goes along. It was extremely obvious in the Alpha series. It's extremely obvious here in the Genexis series, especially considering Genexis spent a lot of time in the entire first episode talking about evidence and what it is. At what point are we allowed to say, okay, there's no evidence for this, so it's not true? It just seems to me that after 2,000 years, if the Christians can't produce anything to support their claims, then why are we still taking all this seriously? I mean, other than the fact that the Christians are trying to force their opinions on everyone else politically.
And that's probably another episode that we're going to do, so I won't bite that bullet just yet. But I do feel the same, and I think that question that you asked is really, really good. At what point do you say, I've looked enough, I've not found, it doesn't exist? And for me, I've passed that point. I did a lot of looking, I did a lot of not finding, so I've given up. And that's the question that I want Christians who are listening to take seriously about atheists like myself and like yourself. We have done some looking and we haven't got anywhere. So very quick question then, before we sign off on this one for the final time. What is it that you want from Christians that would change your opinions?
I would love for a Christian to be able to tell me what non-material actually is. Not what it's not, but what it actually is, or the supernatural, or spirit, or God, or anything. Just something that tells me what it is and a way to actually detect whatever that is,
That's a very good answer. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you again, Darren, and until we bring you back on again, thank you very much. Until next time. You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome all feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.